What's up everyone, Rafila coming at you with a brand new Magic the Gathering video, and as you can tell we do have a beautiful new Chandra Bold Pyromancer playmat, and what better way to celebrate this new playmat than by doing a video talking about every single card in Magic the Gathering that mentions Chandra in name or rules text, with the exception of the Chandra Planeswalkers themselves, as we're going to be doing that in another video. Of course, if you like this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help. I am trying to reach 400 by the end of the year, and consider hitting that bell notification as well so you're updated whenever I release new videos. Now that's out of the way, let's jump into these cards. I'm going to be analyzing them in terms of how they work, more so in a commander deck built around Chandra, but in some cases I'm going to also try to talk about how they would work in a 60 card deck based around Chandra as well. Hope you guys enjoy, and let's get into it. We're going to start things off with one of my favorite Chandra support cards, and that is Chandra's Ember Cat. It's a 2-drop 2/2 elemental cat that we can tap to add red to our mana pool, only to be used to be cast an elemental spell or a Chandra Planeswalker spell. What's interesting about Ember Cat is it doesn't specify elemental creatures, so if you do want to play some tribal elemental spells from back in the Lorwyn and Shadowmoor days, you can feel free to do so. The fact that Chandra does have access to her very own mana dork again makes her a very unique Planeswalker, and of course Ember Cat is a fantastic card and a must run in a Chandra themed deck. Next up, we have Renegade Firebrand, and this is one of the first cards from a Chandra intro deck. Now, each Chandra intro deck, with the exception of the Core Set 2021, does include a creature that specifically wants Chandra to be out on the field. Renegade Firebrand is a 3-drop 3/2, reads as long as you control a Chandra Planeswalker. It has +1/+0 and has First Strike. Now, of course, if you're going full flavor with Chandra rules text and flavor text, this is obviously a mandatory include. If you're trying to be a little bit more competitive with your Chandra build, you do realize that this has some real problems. For starters, it's not an elemental, so a lot of Chandra's cards now care about elementals. It has an ability that only can activate once per turn, in the sense that it can't be stacked, and it is pretty easy to remove as it only has 2 toughness. It doesn't have haste. It'd be better if it had haste, but it does have and has a weak toughness. If it had haste, it would probably be much more worth playing, but yeah, it's probably best used as a blocker, and well, I guess just in the intro deck itself. Next of these is the Kalpulsian Hound, which is a 4-drop 3/3 creature dog, as hounds have become dogs. Whenever it attacks, if you control a Chandra Planeswalker, it deals 2 damage to any target. This suffers from a similar problem to the Renegade Firebrand that we just looked at. Kalpulsian Hound is not terrible in a limited intro deck versus intro deck format, as dealing 2 damage to your opponent when this attacks can be pretty powerful if not answered. The problem is, in formats where removal is pretty plentiful, having access to something that deals 3 damage is not very difficult, although it is harder to find 3 damage than it is 2 damage. So obviously I would argue that Kalpulsian Hound is more useful than the Renegade Firebrand, but it's still not very useful, and I was running it very early on in my original Chandra build, but they took it out because there's just better cards you can play. Next up, we have the Kirk Disciples, which comes to us from Core Set 2021's intro deck. The Core Set 2020 intro deck does not include a card that specifically wants a Chandra on the field, though it does mention her on the flavor text of 2 elementals, and of course the deck also includes Chandras Spitfire. Kirk Disciples is a 4-drop 4/3 human monk that reads whenever you activate a loyalty ability of a Chandra Planeswalker, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Again, it's not an elemental, but it definitely gets a lot more flavor points than the Hound and the Firebrand, because this is actually directly related to Chandra's history back when she was at Carol Cleep, being her Pyromancer abilities from Mother Ludi, aka Jaya Ballard. It also is an ability that can activate more than once per turn, as if you're playing a Chandra deck, well then you're going to be trying to play as many Planeswalkers as you can and try to use as many Planeswalkers as you can every turn. This also, in combination with the Chandra Planeswalker from its intro deck, will a simple +1 activation of that Planeswalker, and this on the field will deal 4 damage to each of your opponents. Also, in response, of course, Kalpulsian Hound only deals 2 damage to any target, which is great, but it's only 1 target. This deals 1 damage to each opponent, making it a lot more versatile. Next up, we have our 4 specific spells that tutor out our specific Chandras from each intro deck. Most Planeswalker intro decks include one card that is able to, in some way, tutor out their titular Planeswalker. The first of these is Liberating Combustion. It's a 5-drop sorcery that deals 6 damage to target creature. Then you get to search your library and or graveyard for Chandra Pyromancer, add it to your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. We're not going to analyze, of course, the Planeswalkers in this video, as we're going to be doing that later down the track. But let's just say that Chandra Pyromancer is probably the worst, one of the worst Chandra intro deck Planeswalkers in my opinion. The next of these is from Dominaria, and it's Chandras Outburst. Again, 5 mana for a sorcery. This time 3 colorless and 2 red, so a little bit more difficult to cast. It deals 4 damage to target player or Planeswalker, and then of course you do the library and or graveyard for the Chandra Bold Pyromancer, which of course is the Chandra that we do have on our playmat here. I do believe that this is a little bit better as it can hit Planeswalkers instead of just creatures. You do lose 2 damage, but obviously the Planeswalker is also better in my opinion, so Outburst is definitely the better card to play than Liberating Combustion. Next we have Chandras Flamewave, which honestly I don't think the Chandras Fury is good at all. It's a 5-drop sorcery that deals 2 damage to target player and each creature that player controls. Then you go ahead and get Chandra Fury from your library or graveyard. If you get it from your library, shuffle, blah, blah, blah. The ability to deal 2 damage to each creature that target player controls can actually be useful, can help clear out token-based strategies. The problem is the Chandra that you get from this is literally horrible and is not playable. Even in like intro deck versus intro deck, it's bad. So honestly, whilst this card itself may be better than something like Outburst, the Planeswalker that Outburst gets you is much better than the Planeswalker that Flamewave gets you. The most recent intro deck Planeswalker searcher we have for Chandra is Chandras Firemore. 5-drop 4/2 Hellion with haste. When it enters the battlefield, you get to search your library and or graveyard for Chandra Flame's Catalyst, reveal it, put it in your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. I honestly think Firemore is the best Chandra tutor that we have so far because it is actually a creature. It is a creature with haste. No, it's not an elemental, which means, of course, Awakened Inferno can remove it, but it does give you a hasteful body that you can then attack with, and as opposed to something else where you literally only do a little bit of damage, get a Chandra, this gives you a body that can either use to block, but you're probably going to attack with it because it has haste. It also searches out the best intro deck Chandra Planeswalker to date, so if you do have space for it, I would consider it running Firemore. Next up, we have our 3 non-creature spells that do care about Chandra, but are not creatures. The first of these is Chandras Regulator. It is arguably the best piece of Chandra support ever printed. It is a 2-drop legendary artifact that reads whenever you activate the loyalty ability of a Chandra Planeswalker. You may pay 1 if you do, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for that copy of that ability. And you can pay 1 and tap it to cycle a mountain or a red card to draw a card. Chandras Regulator is 100% an auto-include in any casual format Chandra deck, or any format where this card is legal and you want to play a Chandra deck. It's essentially a Chain Veil just for Chandra. The card is absolutely ridiculous and must be run in any Chandra deck that can play it. Next up, we have Chandras Defeat and Chandras Triumph. Whilst Defeat is technically not Chandra support, it does fit the criteria of our video in the sense that it does mention Chandra in name and in rules text, and is a nice opposite to Chandras Triumph. It's a 1 red instant that deals 5 damage to target creature or red Planeswalker. If that if it is a Chandra Planeswalker, draw a card. If you do, discard. You can discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So you get to cycle. Chandras Triumph is the nice reverse of this. It is a 2-drop instant that deals 3 damage to target creature or Planeswalker and opponent controls. It deals 5 if you have a Chandra Planeswalker. Now, of course, Chandras Defeat on its own doesn't actually seem like a bad card. A 1-drop instant that deals 5 damage to a red creature or Planeswalker seems really good, and if I had a lot of red creatures or Planeswalkers in my playgroups, I would actually consider running this. The one thing that really stops me running this is that it's called Chandras Defeat, and the last thing I want to do from a flavor perspective is play a card where Chandra's losing. That being said, the card is actually not horrible. The only downside, really, is that it's limited to red. And yes, of course, if you kill a Chandra, you get to cycle, but it's not the best. Chandra's Triumph is a great reference to this card, as it shows her success at the end of War of the Spark, as she's overcome Dovin Baan after all the trials and tribulations he has put her through in the story. So definitely, of course, Chandra's Triumph is an amazing card to run. It definitely, in my opinion, replaces something like Incinerate that used to feature Chandra and Jaya in its flavor text, but of course you can run Incinerate as well if you want flavor points, but it's not technically a Chandra card. Next up, we have Chandras Magma, which is the second dog to be related to Chandra. It's a 2-drop 2/2 that we can tap to deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. I think this card is really good in sealed or limited, potentially limited format if you, or draft. It'd be really good in sealed and draft, as it's just a 2/2 that you can, 2-drop 2/2 that pings 1. Can hit planeswalkers, which is always really good. If you have space in your Chandra deck, you could run it. There's just so many better cards than this for Commander. But in terms of a limited Chandra deck, or just a burn deck, or even a cat dog deck, this is actually not a bad card, so you could definitely consider running it. Next up, we have Chandras Pileup. Is a 2-drop 1/3 elemental lizard. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to opponent, the Pileup gets +1/+0 and gains double strike until end of turn. A 2-drop 1/3 is already a pretty decent deal. It's a nice blocker. The fact that it also gets bigger each time your opponent takes damage from a non-combat damage. Double strike is also really good. The downside of this is that the double strike obviously cannot stack, but being able to get it bigger and bigger can be very, very useful, especially as Chandra's cards like to do lots of little damage a lot of the time. So lots of little instances of multiple damage can add up to a very big piling. It also works really well as a blocker. Next up, we have Chandras Spitfire, which is a 3-drop 1/3 elemental with flying, and it reads, whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage, Chandras Spitfire gets +3/+0 until end of turn. In combination in standard with cards like Scorched Spitter or and Cavalier of Calamity, Chandras Spitfire became absolutely dominating. A 3-drop flyer that could get absolutely insanely big and be very, very difficult to remove unless you specifically had a removal spell in your hand, which wasn't always the case. In Commander, of course, this card can work really well with the Chandra-themed cards, as Chandra does a lot of burning and can get very big. It's also a flyer. It's one of the only flyers that specifically references Chandra, so it is good for flying blockers. Next up, we have the big one with Chandras Incinerator. It's a 6-drop 6/6 elemental that costs X less to cast, where X is the amount of non-combat damage your opponents have been dealt this turn. Notice how it says opponents, not an opponent. So if you're able to deal multiple damage towards multiple opponents, you can get this much, much cheaply onto the field, essentially even down to 1 red mana. Its ability is, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandras Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So this is in addition to the damage you're already dealing. So that way you can focus your Chandras, specifically focus on your opponent's face, and then of course let Incinerator do all the work in clearing out their creatures and planeswalkers. A must run in any Chandra deck that it's legal in format. Next up, we have Chandras Phoenix, which is currently the only Phoenix that is related to Chandra, and it is also another fantastic card to run in a Chandra deck. It is a 3-drop 2/2 with haste and flying, and whenever an opponent is dealt damage by a red instant sorcery spell you control, or by a red planeswalker you control, you can return Chandras Phoenix from your graveyard to your hand. Of course, you can use this as a discard target for cards like Thrill of Possibility, Faithless Looting, Cathartic Reunion. If this gets wheeled by one of your Chandra effects, like Heart of Fire or the one from Rise of the Eldrazi, this card definitely puts in a lot of work. It also has haste, so you can play an attack with it straight away. You can use it as a flying blocker. Definitely a very versatile card nonetheless. Next up, we have Oath of Chandra. Oath of Chandra is a 2-drop enchantment that people honestly think is probably the worst, Planeswalker Oath, it's all subjective. I think it's perfectly fine in a mono red Super Friends deck, because when it enters the battlefield, you get to deal 3 damage to target creature and opponent controls. At the beginning of each end step, if a Planeswalker entered the battlefield under your control this turn, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. You're going to be playing as many Planeswalkers as you want continuously as you can, so the ability to just deal 2 damage to each opponent every time a Planeswalker enters can be pretty useful, and it is nice flavorful for Chandra as well, so if you're looking for flavor points, it's definitely worth considering for running in your Chandra deck. Next up, we have our instants and sorceries that do mention Chandra. We're going to start off with Chandras Pyro Helix. It was originally printed in Kaladesh, but was later reprinted and had its text updated for War of the Spark. It's a 2-drop instant that deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets. Being able to divide 2 damage among 2 targets can be pretty useful, not as much in Commander, but can help you get rid of a few dorks that normally sit around the 1 toughness mark. Being able to hit Planeswalkers and players as well can also be useful, especially in combination with cards you want to deal little bits of damage. Next up, we have Chandras Outrage. 4-drop instant, it deals 4 damage to target creature and 2 damage to that creature's controller. Again, this is an ability we do see on a Chandra Planeswalker, which we'll talk about when we did the video on the Planeswalkers. Being able to hit a creature for 4 and its controller for 2 is good in some situations, but in Commander it's a little bit lackluster, so it normally doesn't see play in Commander versions, but I guess it definitely did. I did see a bit of it played in standard decks built around the Chandras Spitfire. They can help get it quite big. We have Chandras Fury next. It's a 5-drop instant that deals 4 damage to target player and 1 damage to each creature that player controls. Again, it basically wipes out token strategies unless they've got something like Coat of Arms on the field. It is costly at 5 mana, and especially as seeing as it only targets 1 player, it's definitely not that good in Commander, as there are better cards like Blasphemous Act. We have Chandras Revolution. It is a 4-drop sorcery that deals 4 damage to target creature. Tap target land that land doesn't control during its controller's next untap step. This is a 4-drop sorcery. There are so many better things you can cast for 4 mana. Being able to tap down a land in mono red can be very useful, but a lot of the time mono red just wants to blow up that land instead. You can hit lands, I guess, like Gaia's Cradle and a Cavern of Souls or any other key land that they might have. But honestly, there are just better cards, and this just stays as a flavor card, mentioning Chandra in its rules text. Otherwise, it's just, yeah, not something you want to run. And the last card we're going to take a look at is Chandras Ignition. It is a 5-drop sorcery where target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to the creature and each opponent. What's interesting about this is it doesn't affect your creatures in any way, and it doesn't destroy your creature. I was actually running this in my Chandra deck for a really long time, as it is a nice piece of flavor and lore-wise when Chandra gets her spark. The problem is my deck doesn't really run a lot of really big creatures. Of course, I do have the Incinerator, and I could use that to deal 6 damage, but it's very, very specific circumstances where you would use this in a Chandra deck. It is still worth talking about because it's a very powerful card in very specific decks, but for a Chandra deck, it's probably not the best card to run, although it is a nice card, like I mentioned, in a flavor perspective. But anyway, that is it for the cards we're going to take a look at. I believe I've covered every card other than the Planeswalkers that mentions Chandra in name or in rules text. Now, if there's any cards I did miss that meet this criteria, let me know in the comments below. If you did like the video, consider subbing to the channel and hitting that bell notification as well so you're updated whenever I release new videos. If you would like to see a video like this on a character like Sarkhan or Nicol Bolas, for example, let me know as well. I definitely enjoyed making this video and would love to be able to talk about more related cards. Stay tuned for the video where we take a look at every single Chandra Planeswalker in Magic the Gathering. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you for my next one.